I do work for Buckeye Region Anti-Violence Organization, otherwise known as Bravo. We do love our acronyms. You know, today we're actually going to be having a little bit of a conversation and some learning around transgender basics and a little bit of the sexual orientation as well as it relates, but it actually is mutually exclusive from transgender. So sexual orientation and gender identity are separate and different things. We're going to talk a little bit about that as well. So to start out today, though, you know, as we talk about the acronym and the people and culture of LGBTQI, and I will go over all those letters as well. Sometimes it happens that it can create some tension. Some people can feel uneasy about the topic itself, and that's okay. But we found at Bravo that having some community agreements can be helpful. And so the first of those of which I'm sure you're very familiar with, which is confidentiality. Being in the field as well, I understand that we all have a working knowledge of this word. What we mean for the purposes of training and workshops is what's said here stays here, what's learned here leaves here. We want you to take the tips and tools and training out of this room. But if we share personal things about our lives, or if you all choose to share personal things about your life, that's for us today in this room. It's not then our business to go out and share to other people. Using I statements, we can only really speak for ourselves, so we want to focus our ideas about what we think and what we're saying. How many of you thought today that you would come to a training on transgender people and LGBT people, and the first thing the trainer asks you to do is to make an assumption? It's kind of awkward, right? It's okay. It should be awkward. But this is the only time I'm going to ask you to assume anything, and that's to assume good intentions. We all come from different walks of life. We're all on different life journeys that have led us to these rooms today. But we're all here because we want to provide service to people, right? We want people to get healthy, people to be empowered. We want to provide that best service that we can to empower others to healthiness, right? And so knowing that, we're going to assume we're all in this room for a good reason, for good intentions. And so if you have a question today about transgender issues, transgender people, culture, or LGBTQI people and culture, ask your question. Don't worry so much today about in this room or the other satellite rooms about how the language is landing, because it's more important to get the information and learn and grow together today than not ask your question. And that's what we mean by that. Also, move up, move back. It has to do with airtime and how much we're engaging. I very much encourage everybody to engage, but if you find yourself like me, that you're so extroverted you have to talk to think, that's my lot in life. And so I can take up a lot of space and a lot of airtime. And so I have to constantly remind myself to move back a little bit and allow for space for everyone to share. If you find yourself on the other end of that spectrum, and it's more difficult for you to share in groups, I'm going to gently challenge you to engage. The more engagement we have, the better, the more we all learn and we all grow. Please take care of yourself. I'm in social work, that's very important to me. And also topic focused. So as is often also with these presentations, we're here to talk about community, culture, and people, and access to services. What we're not really here to talk about is morality. Wow, I tried to blend two words together. That didn't work very well. Morality and theology. Now, I'm well versed in those topics as well, and I enjoy those conversations. I have business cards available if you want to engage in those conversations. But that's not the topic that I was asked to speak about today. So I'm really going to keep us focused, with your permission, on the topics that we're here to talk about. A little bit about what Bravo does and offers the communities of Ohio. We do crisis support, one-on-one survivor support with survivors of hate and bias violence, domestic and intimate partner violence, sexual assault and stalking, primarily within and on behalf of the LGBTQI communities of Ohio. However, we turn no survivor away based on identity. So we work with all survivors in Ohio. We do safety planning, one-on-one support, resource linkage, police, courtroom, medical, advocacy, and liaison work, and support groups and self-defense classes for the community. We also do a lot of education and outreach. That's primarily my role at Bravo now. And then we also document violence within Ohio. We document hate and bias violence, otherwise known as hate crimes, although does anybody know why I'm saying hate and bias violence instead of hate crime when I'm standing in Ohio? I don't ask rhetorical questions.
Not considered a crime?
It's not considered a crime, right? Ohio's hate crimes law, which is called the Ohio Ethnic Intimidation Statute, excludes the following 3 categories: gender identity, sexual orientation, and disability. So according to the state of Ohio, there are 0 hate crimes based on disability, gender identity, and sexual orientation. We think that's wrong. In fact, we know it is. But we track it, and I'm very careful to usually say hate and violence incident, because when I say hate crime, the people with legal backgrounds get a little, kerfluffled. So, we also track intimate partner or domestic violence within the LGBTQI community of Ohio. We produce 2 annual reports a year, along with in conjunction with the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs, which Bravo is a founding member of back in 1996 and 95, 96. We're going to start out with a little activity here. So if you all could pull out a pen and a piece of paper, or you could jot on a margin of a handout a little bit. I'm going to ask you a series of 4 questions. And these aren't particularly hard questions. I'm going to ask you for your top 3 answers or more. But the more honest you are, the better. And the other thing I'd like you to know about this list is that it's only for you. I'm not going to ask to see it. I'm not going to ask you to show it to anybody. So the first question is, what were or are the most important relationships in your life? What were or are the most important relationships in your life? So this could be a parent, a child, a higher power, a pet, however you define most important. The second question I'd like you to answer is, what places have special significance in your life? What places have special significance in your life? So, for example, it could be your home, your church, your work, the Grand Canyon, grocery store, whatever has special significance to you. The third question is, what life events or topics do you enjoy discussing with your friends? What life events or topics do you enjoy discussing with your friends? So for me, that would be music and singing, politics, and hockey. Go Blue Jackets. It's not our year, but still go Blue Jackets. The fourth and final question, and I know how hard we all work, so I hope this is still relevant for everybody, but what hobbies and leisure activities do you enjoy or remember enjoying, but I hope you still enjoy them. So what hobbies and leisure activities? So for me, that would be singing, hiking, going to hockey games, and so forth. All right, now what I would like you to do with your list that you've created is I would like you to pair up with one other person. If there's a group of 3, that's okay. Just as you can naturally pair up where you're sitting. What I would like you to do is decide who's going to talk first and who's going to engage in the conversation, who's going to lead that conversation. About halfway through, I'm going to say switch, and the other person is going to get a chance to lead that conversation. Here's the thing I'd like you to talk about. Introduce yourself, have a meaningful conversation, but you cannot in any shape or form mention or reference anything you just wrote down on that card. It's all taboo. You cannot talk about it. But you have to have a meaningful conversation. Even if you're asked, you may not talk about what's on your card. You have to come up with something. Okay? So go ahead and pair up. Who here, by show of hands, thought that that was the easiest thing they've ever done in their entire life? All right, no hands. Okay. Who here felt it was somewhat difficult? All right, lots of hands. It's okay to raise your hands again. Who here felt it was really difficult? All right, we're solidly somewhat difficult and a little bit of really difficult. So what made it difficult?
Hiding information.
Hiding information. What else?
Not knowing what to talk about.
Not knowing what to talk about. I did call that all up to the front of your brain, so to speak, right? And then told you couldn't talk about it. That's mean. Yeah.
Well, related to that, not knowing the other person and not knowing something that might seem innocent to bring up that might be uncomfortable.
Right, not knowing the other person, and I would say not knowing the other person's identity, and maybe being uncomfortable or not wanting to, step on their toes or be offensive. Sure, that can make it difficult. One other thing.
Want to talk about something that interests the other person.
You want to talk about something that interests the other person, so you're engaging, right? And so now you're worrying about what you're saying, right? So yes, that's absolutely true. What did anybody else feel, or did anybody feel that you had to use a certain amount of brain space or power in order to remember what was on your card during the conversation? You did this for 2 minutes, 1 minute apiece. Did it feel longer? Maybe for some? What would you tell me if I told you that I want you to do that exercise for an hour, 30 minutes apiece? Keep the conversation going, don't talk about what's on your card. Or a day, or a week, or a month, or a year. You know what? Forget it. I don't want to know what's on your card. Never talk about it again. Get it out of my face. I don't care. Don't talk about it for the rest of your life. Now it's impossible, probably, right? Or at least damaging, right? And so that brain space, that brain power, we can actually make a correlation to stress with that, right? Because we're having to use coping strategies to get through that conversation. What happens when stress is unrelieved over time? We move into crisis. And then we need intervention, which I'm sure this room could provide a lot of, right? So, thinking about that, let's look at the questions I asked you, though. I asked you the persons, places, and things of your life. Who you like to hang out with, where you like to go, what you like to talk about, and what you like to do. Okay, so that's the persons, places, and things of your life. Now don't talk about it. Now thinking about the topic that we're talking about today, what's my point?
People have to live like that, not revealing anything about themselves to remain safe.
Right. Some people have to live like that to remain safe, not talking about things about their life, who they are, what they do. Think about it like this. Let's say, so yes, that is absolutely correct. This is as close as we can get to an activity that kind of looks at what it might be like for somebody to what the community would call, the LGBTQ community would call being in the closet, not publicly or privately professing one's gender identity or sexual orientation, versus out of the closet or coming out, which is publicly or privately professing one's gender identity or sexual orientation. So yes, that's what this is about. I love it for a few more reasons as well. One is that the other reason is that it's cross-cultural. We're using it in the context of LGBT, but we could insert any other category, underserved community, or marginalized persons into this exercise, and it would still be relevant. We could talk about race, we could talk about creed, we could talk about faith, we could talk about immigration status, we could talk about gender, we could talk about all sorts of different things, right? And it would still be relevant. The other thing I really love about this is that it starts to pick apart a myth that still faces the LGBTQ community as a whole, and it's one of the large ones that we still go through all the time. Who here and in other rooms has ever heard someone in their life say, or read it, or heard it on the TV or radio, you know what, it's fine, something to the effect of, it's fine that John's a gay guy or Susan's a trans woman, but for blank's sake, keep it to yourself already. It's one part of your life. I don't need to know about that. Anybody heard that? Right? You know what? As it turns out, identity is much more complex than that. I asked you about your persons, places, and things. If I picked up one of your lists, now I said I wouldn't, so I'm not going to, but if I looked at one question and one answer, that's one part of your life. Never talk about it again. That's not fair. That's not ethical. That's not just. Because as it turns out, our identities are intact. They're intertwined. One thing leads to the next, leads to the next. So say I'm in the closet, in a hypothetical, and I go to work, and I'm not out at work, but I'm out with my friends. So say I'm an out gay person with my friends, but I'm in the closet at work, right? I don't talk about my life because for fear of safety or my job security, right? What you did last weekend, what did you do last weekend, can become a terrifying question. It's an innocuous question. It's looking for someone else's interest. It's trying to have buy-in to their life. It's natural, it's good, but it also can be terrifying for folks. So how we use language becomes very important. So I like to start with that exercise, kind of get our heads around the topic at hand, and just kind of get us feeling about that. Any questions, comments, concerns? Stories, limericks, anything? No? Okay. So this leads into phobias though, right? So phobia is, and I'm sure we could have a long conversation with you teaching me about phobias, but although I think I know a little bit. So phobias are basically irrational fears, right? And transphobia, biphobia, homophobia is the irrational fear and or pity of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and gender nonconforming people, right? So it's an irrational fear and or pity. So feeling sorry for someone is part of a phobia, right? So comments like, "Oh, I'm so sorry that they have to go through that and that they choose that quote lifestyle." That's phobia based, right? Instead of saying things like, "I'm really proud of you and I want to celebrate your identity with you." That's not phobia based. So let's talk about where phobia is, or how phobia is manifested in the United States. What does it look like? Transgender people are 4 times more likely to live in poverty in the United States of America. 4 times more likely. Trans people in general have twice the rate of the general population with unemployment. Trans women of color have 4 times the national rate of unemployment. Now let's talk about intersectionality and poverty and oppression. 90% of transgender people report experiencing harassment, mistreatment, or discrimination on the job. 90%. Now in the state of Ohio, is there any legal recourse for that? So we're standing in the city of Columbus, in the state of Ohio, which resides in the United States of America. It's kind of like a Russian nesting doll, right? There are different levels of laws that apply to all those municipalities, right? So in the city of Columbus, so for example, I am gay. I am also, you're welcome, I just came out. And I do that on purpose because I've been out for 22 years, but I just came out again. It's never a one and done. Right? That list activity, that list is permanently planted in my head. My persons, places, and things. And I will change them at the drop of a dime if I don't feel safe. It doesn't necessarily become easier, but it gets more automatic as time goes on. So I'm also, I consider, and we're going to talk about some of these words, but genderqueer, right? I don't identify as a man or a woman, and I prefer gender neutral pronouns as they and them when people refer to me. And not he and him or she or her. So I just came out to you in 2 different ways, right? 2 different identities. Could security escort me out of this building based on that identity or the perception of that identity? Is that legal? Unfortunately, in Ohio, it is legal. In Columbus, it's not. There's a civil rights protection for public accommodations, right? But in the state, there's not. In fact, I could be fired, not hired. I could be evicted, or I could be kicked out of public accommodations. So I can sit down in a restaurant in any suburb of Columbus and they say, "We don't serve your kind here, get out." And I have no legal recourse. That's the law. And a lot of people don't know that. So 90% of transgender people report experiencing harassment on the job, and there's nothing, right? Now if you're a federal employee, that's different. Because President Obama did sign an act, an executive order extending job protections to federal employees and anybody doing contracts with the federal government for employment protection. 22% of respondents who have interacted with police report harassment by police, with much higher rates reported by people of color. Almost half of respondents, 46%, reported being uncomfortable seeking police assistance. 41% of respondents reported attempting suicide. What that means? So the average attempted suicide rate for the general population is about 1.6%, right? 41 to 46% of trans people attempt suicide. That's nearly half. And probably the most damning or dangerous or scary stat that I have right now, not to be, I don't want to scare people, but it's true. In 4 months, in less than 4 months in 2015, there have been 15 LGBTQ homicides based on identity in the United States of America. So 15 people have been murdered in less than 14 months in the United States, some here in Ohio. Of those 15 LGBTQ homicides, 53%, were transgender victims of homicide. in less than 4 months. If that's not epidemic proportions, I don't know what is. So this is how homophobia, transphobia, biphobia play out in real life. This is the picture in which trans people wake up into, gender nonconforming and trans people wake up into, when they breathe air into their lungs in the morning, this is the society they're waking up into and walking out their door in the morning, our door in the morning, right? So it's no wonder people fear services. There is an implicit or implied bias, right? And that becomes our job to overcome. Like even before somebody walks through the threshold for service, whether it's mandated services or whether it's voluntary, there is an expectation of discrimination for LGBT people. It's our job to overcome that. So with those stats that we just went over, I want to just point to my little iceberg friend here. That's what we see. We think that that's about 10% of the problem. What we can't see is all of the microaggressions or harassment or name-calling or, we have reports of in assisted living facilities, people praying over people that can't get out of their beds, things like that. That we're not seeing. That's all below the surface of the water. We see the murders. We see the physical assaults. That's the 10%, which is damaging enough. But what else is happening underneath the surface? That's in our everyday lives. That's in our service provision. That's what we need to fix. And then the 10% will get fixed as well. So I would like to do another little activity here real quick. And I would like you to, again, pair up in small groups. But you only have about a minute or so to do this a piece. So a couple minutes. Here, I'll let this go. What I would like you to do is think about something you just did in your life. Like you went out to dinner, or you went to a movie, or you got up and you interacted with somebody today, a friend, a colleague, somebody. I would like you to recount that story, but I would like you to use absolutely no gendered language. None. What do I mean by gendered language? Pronouns, he, she, they, them, those are pronouns. We can't use that, but they and them is gender neutral, so you can use that, right? So no gendered terms. Also, waitress, waiter, gender neutral is server, right? Flight attendant, not stewardess or steward. Don't use any gendered language and tell your story. Go ahead and pair up. So how was that?
Tricky.
A little tricky?
Yeah.
A little awkward?
You have to focus.
You had to really focus, right? So I like to tell this story about my friend, Ezra, who I met in high school. Ezra and I met in a very unique way. We were standing in a room full of other students, and Ezra mentioned to one of their friends that they had tickets to the Pink Floyd concert coming up, but no way to get there. Now, I had seen Ezra in the hallway, and I kind of wanted to get to know them, right? In an intriguing kind of way, and a bold, uncharacteristic move for me, I spun around and said, I have a car. And we went to the concert together, and we're still friends today. They live in Seattle, so we don't see each other very much. What gender is Ezra?
Probably a one.
Interesting. Ezra does identify as male. He uses he, him pronouns. So it's interesting when we use gender-neutral language, right? That's not easy, by the way. I've practiced that story a lot. I mess it up, too, all the time, on the microphone sometimes. It just comes out, right? Because it's so insidious. It is ingrained in our language from the moment of birth. We get a pink hat or a blue hat, and that's the biggest travesty ever. Because we don't know what someone's gender is at birth. Which leads us to language. Now, language is foundational. This is also how we start to overcome that implicit implied bias, right? Is language. So these language categories, we break them out into 3 categories: gender identity, sexual orientation, and sexual behavior. These are mutually exclusive. They have absolutely nothing to do with one another. However, they're related. Because they're part of identity. So they connect, but they're not related or controlled by each other. So, sexual orientation is an innate essence. It either is or is not. It's also fluid. Now I lost everybody. They're like, you can't have that both ways. Aha, but I can. This is why. So sexual orientation, really briefly, it is an innate essence, but it's also fluid because we have to find our sexual orientation. We're all assumed to be heterosexual at birth. Okay, fine. We can get over that. But if you're not heterosexual, that can be a lifelong journey to find that sexual orientation. So it's going to be a little fluid as well. But it either is or is not. It's simply an attraction or a sexual or a romantic attraction towards another human being. That's different than sexual behavior. Sexual behavior is how you like to be touched and how you like to touch other people with consent. Anything else is sexual assault or rape. The consent is the key. But that's different than orientation. No matter how short or long that trip is from attraction to behavior, attraction happens first. That's orientation. Orientation is not a preference. If we use terms like sexual preference when we mean sexual orientation, it is offensive. And this is why. Preference implies intensity, which inherently implies choice. So whether we think we are or not, we're making a political statement that someone is choosing their sexual orientation. Now, the American Psychological Association just came out and went a step further in their analysis. For years, they've said conversion therapy and things like that are contraindicated, right? They can harm people. They actually just went a step further and made a statement that sexual orientation is not a choice. We are born with sexual orientation. We cannot try to change it. It's very dangerous. And they're making attempts to do rule changes to actually make it possible for counselors to lose their licenses if they practice conversion therapy. So when we say things like sexual, if we all walked out and look at my car for a minute. It's a 1999 green Volkswagen Cabrio convertible, and I look dang cute driving it. I love my convertible. I got it 2 weeks before winter, so I've only had the top down like 6 times, and I'm itching, right? However, I don't really prefer the color green. I would prefer blue or gray. But you know what? The car was in great condition. It's what I needed when my other car died. It fell in my lap, so to speak, and so I bought it. I settled for green. I don't go out and look for a partner and I want that partner to be male identified or whatever I want, like whatever my orientation is toward, right? But I'll settle for a woman. It doesn't work the same way. There's no preference. It is an innate essence. It's an orientation. So when we say sexual preference, what we actually sound like is, oh, that's okay, sweetheart, you can choose that. It's patronizing and instantly alarming. We lose rapport by a simple word. That's how we overcome that expectation. Interestingly enough, we often forget one sexual orientation when we talk about sexual orientation, and that would be heterosexual. After all, every living human being on the face of the world has a sexual orientation and a gender identity. Everybody has them, right? So when we talk about policy and access and putting that in there that, for example, we don't discriminate based on sexual orientation or gender identity and at all, we're actually covering everybody. It is equal rights. It's not special. It's not different. So gender identity. So we talked a little bit about sexual orientation, but so there's this thing in the world, in the world, and it got convoluted, right? It got mixed up. So back in the 80s when we couldn't say the word sex in our country anymore because somehow that was evil and wrong and dirty, and we started to change all our forms to say gender, male and female. Yeah, that was a mistake. Turns out sex and gender are absolutely not synonyms. They do not mean the same thing. Sex is biology. Sex is chromosomes, hormones, and genitalia. Don't ever ask about genitalia, but I'll go into that in a minute too. So that's sex, right? We all have a sex too. That's male, female, and intersex. Intersex is it's a preferred term to an outdated pejorative term of hermaphrodite. And usually I go into why that's a pejorative term, but I'm going to not do that today. So what is gender? Gender is our sense of masculine and feminine. Gender is how we feel about our own body. Gender is between our ears. It's different than sex. And there's a spectrum. Actually, it may be even individual points on a plot. Like, 6 billion people, 6 billion gender identities, right? We can start thinking about it like that. Because identity is so intrinsic to who we are and how we feel that it becomes a beautiful thing. So gender expression is the outward appearance. So I mentioned I consider myself genderqueer. I don't identify as a man or a woman, but my expression, at least today, is pretty masculine. I've got a tie on, I've got a big belly, I've got a beard, right? Ain't nobody gonna question my gender identity as I walk down the street. That's privilege in one way. In another way, how many times do you think people reference me as he as I walk through the world? A lot. Yeah.
A lot.
A lot. Oh, sorry. Yeah. A lot. Every day, all day. I don't use the term he, I use the term they and them. Right? Now, okay, yeah. We may think that's minor, but it's not really minor. Because it's identity. And in essence, what I'm saying is that we should be asking folks what their preferred gender pronouns are. What are yours? I'm not going to make you say them. But have you ever thought about that? What happens if if you were to sit down today at dinner at a restaurant and somebody called you by the pronoun that you don't prefer to use, how would you react? Some of us would be quite offended. Some of us might not be. There are folks that like all pronouns, right? That use all pronouns. And gender identity, too, is not a determinant and is not related to sexual orientation or connected to sexual orientation. They're mutually exclusive. There's a video. It goes into a lot more depth about what I was just talking about. So the difference between sex, gender role, and sexual orientation. It's called Transgender Basics. And if you type Transgender Basics into YouTube, it will be the first video there. It's 19 minutes, 27 seconds long or something like that. But even though it's dated, it's still all very, very, very relevant. So I wanted to make a note, though, about that sort of thing that I just referenced a minute ago about not asking about genitalia. There are so very, 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 very few reasons we would need to know that. Most of them have to do with medical health. And so if that is part of your role, then maybe you need to ask some of the questions. But it's so very easy for us to ask questions with good intentions. Now, let me ask this. Anybody ever have somebody say to you, you know, that wasn't my intention. I didn't intend for that I didn't intend to hurt you or upset you. How many of us felt better when somebody said that? Maybe a few, right? Were you happy though? Did it make it hurt less? Were you instantly healed from all that trauma? Probably not, because the impact was already there. What we need to do is we need to train our minds to think about impact, not intent. What is the impact of the language that I'm saying right now having on the person or persons I'm talking to? Not my intentions. Actually, they're somewhat irrelevant. Because if we negatively impact a situation, it's going to take us a long time to overcome that, right? Versus if we focused on our impact instead of our intent, we might actually not have the negative impact. And so asking questions related to someone's body and how it looks without clothes on might sound alarming to you, right? Oh, I would never do that. Now let me ask a question though. Oh, you're transgender. What surgeries have you had? Sounds well-intentioned, right? I'm curious. I'm trying to engage somebody in a conversation about their identity. Let me rephrase that question for you of how it sounds to a lot of people that are transgender. Oh, you're transgender. What's your penis look like? Oh, you're transgender. Well, how was your vagina formed? We don't ask those questions, right? And we shouldn't. So we need to think about the impact of our language. And one way we can do that is thinking about the binaries that we set up in the world. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and I would like you to raise your hand. You must raise your hand to they're either or questions. You must raise your hand to one of the categories. It is not an option. And you have to choose. Are you a blonde? Raise your hand. Are you a brunette? Raise your hand. Not everybody raised their hand. Are you a blonde? Raise your hand. Are you a brunette? Raise your hand. There's still some rule breakers. All right, I'm going to try another one. You care about laws and politics? You don't care about any law or politics. And now a lot of people didn't raise their hands. Now you're all rule breakers, right? You care about politics and the law? You don't care about any politics or any law. All right. You love your job? You hate your job, and you want nothing to do with it. And if your supervisor's in the room, be careful. How about another one? You dress professionally? Or you're a slob? All right. You are a parent? You are someone's child. You can't raise your hand twice. You have to pick one. You're a parent? You're somebody's child.
I don't know.
Right? Now these get more difficult. How do we do this in practice to people in different ways? The forms.
Yeah.
Are you male or are you female? That's a binary. That's an either or. That's a problem. Right? There's also intersex when we're talking about sex. When we're talking about gender, it gets much more expansive. Sexual orientation gets expansive. When I go and look for a doctor, for a new doctor, now I'm lucky. I have pretty kick-in health insurance because my partner has a very awesome job and I get that benefit, right? But when I walk into a doctor's office, they ask me a question: marital status. I get five options: married, widowed, divorced, separated, or single. Where am I on that scale? I have a partner of 14 years. For all intents and purposes, we're married. We have commingled assets. Everything in the house except the dining room table, which came to from my family, which I will get back, is ours. We have 2 cars. We have a lot of privilege, right? Middle class. What happens if we have to separate those assets? I don't know, because we can't get married, so we can't get divorced. So actually, if I want anything, I do know, unfortunately. If I want anything from that relationship, should it dissolve and should it get ugly, I have to sue him in common police court, not domestic court. So the idea, though, that I would check married is really problematic because I'm not married. It would be lying on an official form, number one. And number two, it doesn't actually describe what our relationship is. So then I'm left with an option. I can either lie, or I can make my own box, say partnered, and check it, which is what I do. But again, that comes from privilege, because if I piss that doctor off, I just take my happy self down the street and find a new doctor. Now imagine I only have one clinic to go to. Now that becomes much more difficult. So our forms, we do this all the time, the either or game. Some of that is mandated by government, but there are ways that we can talk about it to make it better. There's this form I'm going to have to ask you some questions on. I know it's in a binary format, and if it doesn't fit you, I would like you to answer these questions in the way that you want, and we'll figure out how to fill out the form together. We should always have another option of self-identify, blank. We like the term self-identify, not the term other, because if the clients or patients or residents see the term other, it can be alarming, it can be triggering. So self-identification becomes important. So our handy-dandy genderbread person here, I've used this so long that I know I'm going to go into a bakery at some point and say, I need some genderbread people, and they're going to look at me really funny. Every living human being on the face of the earth has all of these things. This is you, right here. This is you, right? This is me. Now, I just did a very passionate 2 minutes on don't ask people about their genitalia, and unfortunately, this diagram puts the sex symbol right where I told you not to focus on, so please ignore that. It's still very informative. So we all have a gender expression. It's how we, an expression is how we promote ourselves to the outside world. Then we have our identity, which is gender. It's in our head, it's in our ears, it's between our ears. It's a feeling. We have attraction, which is sexual orientation, and we have sex, which is our biology. So, what we can actually do, and you actually have these charts broken down in your handouts, what you can actually do is you can plot yourself on these. These are all scales. They can move around from day to day, right? Especially expression. Like today, my scale would look different than tomorrow when I wear my kilt and have purple nails, right? And that may seem trivial to some, but it's not. It's really not. So we all have gender identity, we have gender expression, biological sex, who we're attracted to, which is sexual orientation. So we can plot ourselves on these scales, and I recommend that you do that. That you just take it kind of on your own, maybe in your room or in your office, plot yourself on that scale, and maybe hang it up on your bathroom mirror so you see it every day. Or not. But it's just keeping in mind that we all have something in common. We all have all of these attributes about our lives. Appropriate terms and language, I said it's foundational. I wish I had a cheat sheet, and I can't tell you how much I wish I had the 6 words that I could say to any human being in the world and they would be right. That doesn't exist, unfortunately, because we're all unique individuals. And so I gave you this as well. This is as close as we've come. So what we say about sexual orientation is that we should be using the orientation words: gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, omnisexual, all sorts of different sexual orientations, right? We should be using those words. We shouldn't be using words like homosexual. Now, why might I ask you not to use the word homosexual? Because you're going to be like, but Aaron, you are a homosexual. And I'm going to say yes. But please don't call me that. Why don't I like that word?
It's baggage from the old days. Absolutely,
it's baggage. It used to be a diagnosis in the DSM-3. They removed it in the DSM-4. There was forced institutionalization, there was electroshock treatment, there was lots of things that happened to diagnosed homosexuals. It's also kind of, it's cold and clinical, right? And usually when we hear that word, it's in a negative context. Those homosexuals did this, or things like that, right? So a lot of us say, please don't use that word. However, it's not that easy, because self-identification trumps everything. So if somebody walks into my office and says, "Hi Aaron, I'm a homosexual," I don't go, "Don't call yourself that," because that's rude and patronizing, right? It's not ethical. So I'll be like, "Hi, my name's Aaron," right? So we meet people where they are, right? We want to reflect the language they're using. So if somebody refers to themselves as homosexual, I'm going to use that language with them, even though it's uncomfortable for me. So, we talk about sexual orientation, not sexual preference. We talked a lot about that already. There is sexual preference, but that has to do with sexual behavior. That goes back to how we like to touch, how we like to be touched with consent. It has nothing to do with orientation. Gay culture and community, not gay lifestyle, or alternative lifestyle, or trans lifestyle. It's not a lifestyle. It's a culture and a life. So we don't, lifestyle trivializes things in a way that feels uncomfortable for most people. I think about the lifestyles of the rich and famous, and don't I wish, but that's just not me. Transgender, trans-identified. We don't want to use terms like transvestite or transgendered with an ED. We don't want to make that a past tense word, because that is somebody else's journey, it's somebody else's identity. It's not for us to define in that way. Also, intersex and not hermaphrodite. The word queer, really briefly, that might make a lot of us uncomfortable, yes? It is still a negative pejorative word. It is still used as a slur. However, the LGBTQI, which stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex, there are positive connotations to the word queer. Lots of people within the LGBTQI community are starting to identify as queer. Simply, I am queer. I am different but fine. That's what the word means, right? So there are also uniqueness about the word is that it's ungendered. If I say gay, we're going to think of men primarily. If I say lesbian, we're going to think of women primarily. If I say queer, it could be anybody. It's ungendered. And that appeals to a lot of people. Now, there's still negative connotations. It's a negative slur, right? It can bring up past trauma. It can be used to harm people. And so because of that, I don't ever advocate, and I don't myself walk down High Street or anywhere I am and go, "Hey, queers, how you doing?" Right? Because my impact would be negative to those around me. Now, if somebody I'm working with identifies as queer, I'm going to refer to them as a queer person because that's what they've asked me to do. So I need to get used to that word. Now, it's also generational, right? So I actually do love the word queer. I identify as queer most often. I also identify as gay. But I like the word. It feels good to me. However, our office manager can't stand the word. makes his skin crawl, right? Now, there's a generational difference, right? He's in his mid-60s. He was called queer on the playground when he was growing up. I was called faggot on the playground when I was growing up. And that word makes my skin crawl, right? So it's generational, it's geographic. And so we need, but it's becoming more and more common, so we talk about it. Because we need to understand when we're interacting with people, like if patients are coming in here saying I'm queer, that's not necessarily negative self-talk, right? That could be an empowering, embracing word for them, and we need to know that before we interact with them. We also, incidentally, should reflect that language if that's what they want when we talk about them and refer to them. So when we're thinking about our facilities and how we do our work, what do we fear in working with transgender people? Right? Because normally where people go about fears are these things. I am afraid there'll be violence in our facility if we serve transgender people or LGBTQ people. I'm afraid that there'll be sexual exploitation of patients, by patients or staff, if we're being honest. Now, I will ask this. Are there policies and procedures and protocols and culture in place to deal with violence or sexual exploitations of patients already? Good, you're covered. We know how to deal with these things. We deal with them all the time. Unfortunately, it's a reality of society, right? So just because somebody has a different identity doesn't mean it's different, right? It means we might need to expand our access policies and understand identity and do trainings like this over and over again until we get comfortable with it. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we don't know how to handle things within the facility. Patients feeling fear and being triggered. We can't eliminate triggers, right? We cannot eliminate triggers. And if we artificially try to eliminate triggers, we're actually doing our patients a disservice. We are supposed to be there to help people get through triggers. And if we're eliminating them before they ever happen, whether we know they'd happen or not, because generally speaking, it might not actually be a trigger for somebody to see somebody of another identity. Could be, but we should be there to help them through it, not eliminate it. I look at that one like this. I used to run homeless shelters in Chicago for 7 years. I was social services director for a large homeless services agency in Chicago. We had 3 emergency shelters and 100 units of apartments. Lots of residents. And I used to say to my residents all the time, who would come to me, because we transitioned our shelters to shelter of identity, not biology, so you chose which shelter you would go to. And they were 60 cots on a floor. This is communal living, and it's not its finest, but that's what it was, right? It's what it is. I used to have residents come up to me and say, why is this person in the shelter? They don't need to be there, and things like that. And I would say to them, you know what, I'm not kicking somebody out because you are uncomfortable. That is not my job. We can talk about this, let's talk through it, let's talk about the comfortability, but being uncomfortable does not equal being unsafe. Those are different concepts. And my job is to create the safest space possible for the most people possible. I'm not kicking people out because they're uncomfortable. Now, it was voluntary services where I was working, so that's a little different, right? So I could say things like, you know what, our services are voluntary and I'm not kicking people out because they're uncomfortable, but if people choose to leave, there's the door. I didn't say it like that because I was in a supportive and empowering environment, but that's kind of what I meant. Like if you're uncomfortable in services and we're creating a safe place for you to be, I want to talk to you about being comfortable, but if ultimately it's your choice to leave the services, then that's your choice. But I'm not kicking anybody out. Sexual harassment on patients, I go back to policy and procedure already in place. How about bathrooms? That's typically a huge topic, right? So on patients, I'm assuming patients is the, okay. How do bathrooms work? Are they big rooms that anybody can walk in and out of with no locks?
The patient units, yeah, they have a bathroom in their room.
That makes it really easy. And you know, I think in some of those situations too, we could actually think about re-signage. If people are only using one at a time, why doesn't it say gender neutral restroom? You know, there's a restaurant, now they're single stall restrooms, but there's a restaurant in the Short North area, Victorian Village area called Till, used to be called Dragonfly. Their restrooms, I love them so much because you walk up to the door and it's a mirror. That's your restroom. They don't have, that's the symbol for restroom, is a mirror, so you're looking at your own face. Right? So we need to rethink that. But if they're locking stalls, if they're individual restrooms, you know, it's just going to pee, right? Like, we don't need to be regulating that as so much. Sleeping rooms gets complicated as well sometimes. Like, where do we house folks? At the Homeless Services Agency I worked at, we moved to a shelter of identity. And that was rough, right, for a lot of the residents. Actually, I'm going to be a little bit of a downer here because it was more rough for the staff. We did months of trainings like this with our staff. Some of them didn't make it. Some of them chose to leave employment because they just didn't want to work there anymore. But at the same time, in a nonprofit or in a mission-based work environment, at that point, as a director, I was like, this is our mission. If you're not in line with our mission, I'm not firing you because you're not breaking any rules, but you need to think about where you want to work. I don't want you to go. I want to work through this. Some people chose to work through it. Some people said it wasn't for them. That's okay. But sleeping is, and we had, you know, cisgender, and I didn't define that term. But cisgender meaning CIS meaning same, so same gender as your sex, so your gender lines up with the sex you were assigned at birth. We had cisgender people sleeping next to trans people, sleeping next to gay people, sleeping next to lesbian people, like everybody went to whatever shelter, right? And so, and it worked. It took a while, but it worked. We also did these meetings and these trainings with our residents. So we started to attempt to bring these things up in group. We brought them up in different ways. We hung signage, we hung posters, we changed our policies and made sure every patient, or no, sorry, resident knew about it, right? And so over time, you know what happened? I'd say over a 12 to 15 months, 12 to 16 month period, the number of trans people that we were serving in shelter went up. You know why?
I feel comfortable.
Right. We had good outcomes. People in the community started talking. Wait, I think that this service provider might actually know something. Might actually treat people okay. And so it wasn't a floodgate. Like, we're not saying that this is going to be like tomorrow, like 150 people are going to be busting down your door. That didn't happen. But the census went up, and I think that's important to kind of reflect on, about overcoming that expected discrimination. So elements of inaccessible programs really are the programs that don't talk about these issues in their literature or their outreach materials or their policies, and you know, with patients and with the community. They stay locked into a gendered model, or they stay locked into talking points that were created a long time ago that might not fit the current day identity of a lot of people. Using language like tolerate or alternative lifestyles. Why might not I like the word tolerate?
It implies a negative.
It does. It implies a negative. Why? Whoa, okay, so if I have to tolerate it, if I'm tolerating something, there's an irritant to be tolerated. I make the analogy that I can tolerate a rock in my shoe for about a block, and then I'm taking my shoe off. And I'm shaking it. I'm trying to shake it to the front so it's not under my foot, right? That's tolerance. If we're really talking about acceptance, tolerance isn't even an issue. So elements of accessible programs. We talked a little bit about signage a minute ago, but having signs up like gender-neutral restrooms. And also having some sort of rainbow, or the pink, white, and blue flag for transgender, or upside-down pink triangle in different places. So patients and folks coming into our facilities know that we're serving all people. And that's for LGBT people, but we probably need more for other identities. Yeah.
If a facility or a business wanted to revise its forms according to some of the suggestions that you're making, are there models to emulate?
Yes. And actually Bravo does provide, I can provide technical assistance in looking at forms and making suggestions, providing models for new forms. That's certainly something, and that's also, all our services are free. So now, at Bravo, we have a pretty extensive intake form for our services. And we ask about gender identity, sexual orientation, disability. We ask about all sorts of different demographics and also identity questions. And there are also, there are models for healthcare, there are models for social services agencies, and all can be borrowed from. But generally speaking, we get out of the binary with the forms and starting to ask questions in more universal and less gendered language, and not leading the person to answer a question. And so we'd be happy to provide any of those resources and or technical assistance. And so that's a lot too of how accessible programming can happen. All right, that's it for my portion.
My name is Lana Moore, and I am a fire captain with the Columbus Division of Fire. I was born and raised here in Columbus, Ohio. I have a twin sister, 2 older sisters, and an older brother. And I work at Fire Station 19, where I've been since 2003, so what is that, 12 years? And I am also on the National Board of Directors for GLAD. GLAD was formerly known as the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation. Back in 2013, we decided that GLAAD did not have a B, or T, or Q, or I. It was not inclusive, and thereby, as well as some other national organizations, we dropped the acronym. We still go as GLAD, but it stands for GLAD. And GLAD was formed back in the 1980s out of necessity during the AIDS epidemic, crisis, and awareness. And similar to the Anti-Defamation League for Jewish people, there was a need to have like a media watchdog group, somebody to hold the media news accountable, that information that was being put out was accurate, honest, and not defamatory. And so that is what GLAD does for the LGBT community. We work with media, print media, news media, we work with Hollywood, all sorts of media to see that our stories are told honestly and accurately. My friend Jenny Boylan, who was on the board with me, as she liked to say, it's harder to hate someone once you know their story. And many of you will remember here just how many years ago it's been, but Will and Grace, you know, that put some gay men right in people's homes. Suddenly, a lot of the myths, a lot of the fears and things that people drew out of thin air to be worried about, they realized these are just human beings. These are likable human beings. And that television show probably did more for LGBT acceptance than lots of rallies and all of the lobbying and more tangible things that we go out there and do. So GLAD is a precursor to change. We change hearts and minds by telling our stories. And that's my reason for being here with you today. Aaron did a fantastic job with all educating and all those things, and they are very good at it. And one thing I'm an expert on, and that's my story. So, who am I? I'm a child of the 60s. I was raised as male, and I transitioned about 6-7 years ago on the Division of Fire as a fire captain. And a lot of people had a lot of fears. as Aaron was pointing out, what are the fears you have having trans people in your facility or in your space? And a lot of people, they pull things out of thin air. They had, when I transitioned, I went on light duty it ended up being 21 months. We thought it was going to be a year. And I left the fire station and I went to a desk job and took care of physical things in my transition. And when I was about to come back to the station, unbeknownst to me at the time, there was a big powwow. They had the chief and a union representative and the guys in the fire station, and they were all bringing up, I didn't even know what was going on. I found out about it later, and I talked to my battalion chief, and he said, oh, they want warning. They don't want you to just show up back one day. And I thought about that, and I thought, well, that's, they wouldn't, anybody else who's on light duty, for whatever health reason, who was coming back, would never be asked to warn everyone. And I thought, well, I'll give them a few days, but it was kind of, the implication was like, so they would all have time to transfer out. And I found out later that there were people who said if they had to work at my station, they'd call in sick. And the chief revealed to me that they had raised concerns of, well, our children won't be able to come visit us at the firehouse anymore. And so these are the things that when people don't know, when they've never met a trans person, these are the kind of things people think. And I'd like to ask, on the sheet, on one of your handouts, I've got some statistics. And the first one is 90% of Americans will raise their hand if they ask if they personally know a gay, lesbian, or bisexual person. So how many here in the room would answer that affirmatively, that they know a gay or lesbian or bisexual? Okay, now, how many people in the room would answer that question if I asked how many of you know a transgender person? So not as many. The statistics show only 8%. So I'm hoping, after I spend a little time with you here this afternoon and get to know me and know my story, the next time someone asks you, do you know a trans person, you can say, well, I've been more. And so my story goes, I came back to the station. I came back a few days later. I called and asked who was cooking. And they put JJ on the phone. And I said, JJ, I'd like to come in Wednesday for lunch and get in for lunch. I said, okay. So I came in on Wednesday, and it was very awkward. The guys were very quiet. We had a very awkward lunch. And at the end, I just said, I wanted you all to know that I've been released from light duty. That it was my choice. I'm coming back because I'm ready. And I will be here Sunday. So Sunday I came in. It was awkward. We had a very awkward roll call. I went out and washed the truck, did everything the way we normally did. And so then, after we did our morning duties and housework, I called everyone to the kitchen. And they were sitting there with their arms crossed, staring at the ceiling. And I think they thought they were going to get a trans 101 course or diversity training or something like that. And that's not what I did. I told them. I owned up to the problems I had been facing prior to my announcement. I had been going through a divorce. I had started hormone therapy. I physically changed before their eyes. They didn't know what they were seeing. I lost a lot of weight. They all thought I had cancer prior to me coming out to them. And so I had been missing some runs and just not being present like I needed to be. And that's part of why I went on light duty in the first place. And so I took ownership of those things, and I told them that I fixed it all. And I'm back in my job, ready to be their captain. And it was like a big weight lifted off. They relaxed, they started smiling, we had our Sunday brunch like we normally do in the house on Sunday. And about halfway through the day, it was like I had never left. And it's been one of them ever since. And, when I tell my story, I am so blessed. A lot of people that I know right here in Ohio, in Cleveland and Cincinnati, Akron, and other parts of the country, they say, Lana, you live in a bubble in Columbus. And I didn't realize that how progressive Columbus is. Now, it's not perfect, but the city of Columbus, mayor, safety director, fire chief, my whole chain of command, they stepped up and they treated me like a human being. And there were leaders on the Division of Fire who, we have a saying in the fire service that leaders lead from the front, and that's what they did. And my union president, I heard a story, a guy was TT'd in our station. The TT means temporary transfer. So that's a person that's filling in from another house. And he started asking me questions. And I can usually tell, most firefighters don't even want to talk about my transition and me being trans. They're okay with it, they just don't want to talk about it. I think you touched on that a little bit. And so he started asking me questions, and I didn't even know this gentleman. And he shared with me that he's on the executive board with our union. And shortly after I had made my announcement, they had an e-board meeting, and one of the guys kind of cynically said, what are we going to do about Captain Moore? And Jack, our union president, stood up and said, what do you mean what are we going to do? She's a human being, she's our sister, we're going to treat her accordingly. And he tells me that they all just fell in line there. They were like, oh, okay. So I like to tell those stories because so often when people hear transgender, they, like my oldest sister, they start pulling things out of thin air. Things like maybe they've seen negative things on TV, like Jerry Springer show and things like that. And, once they experienced start to know me in real life, those things just kind of vanish. So it's amazing the barriers that can vanish when people do the right thing and don't make it a thing. I like to say in the city of Columbus, they treated it like less is more. They didn't single me out. The chief of division, retired now, Chief Pettis told me two things. He said, I support you. Well, it's actually three things. I support you. I want you to be a success story, and I won't tolerate any harassment. That was it. That was it. So, this picture here, this was my boyfriend's idea. I was telling him about this, and I said, well, I don't have a PowerPoint, but it's always nice to have something on the background so they don't just stare at me the whole time. So he said, you should get a picture up there and put your name and your contact information on there so people will know who you are. And so I picked out a picture from, this was actually taken a couple months ago, and I apologize. I worked that out with a phone app called Pixar, and I didn't realize my name was going to be so big, so it seems pretentious. I didn't mean that. But these are two kids from the neighborhood, and their mother brought them in to meet me. And the reason, and I get a little bit emotional about this, the reason the mother of these two kids brought them in to meet me is because one of them is trans. She wanted her daughter to meet a real-life trans adult so that she would see that she can have a future. And I grew up in the 60s, and I didn't have that. I didn't have any examples on television. I didn't have any trans adults, anything other than, I think, Renee Richards and Christine Jorgensen. Those are the only two people I'd ever thought about. So there was nothing in real life for me to even know that I could ever be who I felt like I was on the inside. And so she wanted to bring her little girl, who is male and female trans, and to meet me. They came in yesterday to see me as well. And I'm also working with a mother and a family down in Portsmouth who also have a trans daughter about 6 years old. And unfortunately, we have a long way to go in our society because these children are not only facing adversity from other kids, bullying from other kids who maybe don't know better, but they're getting it from adults. And this little girl as well is, and her mother gave me permission to share this information, share this story. But her brother there, who's 2 years older, was told by an adult female in their lives not to call his sister by her name, but to call her by the male name. And he stood up for his sister. Yes, I know there's a lot of confusion that way. A lot of people in transition, when they reveal they're trans, people will ask which way. Sometimes it's not clear. So, but I wanted to talk about my privilege. Growing up in this society for most of my life, to the outward world, being a white male, I enjoyed a lot of privilege that I just did not realize I was enjoying until I lost it. And I am still quite privileged because I benefit from all those years, having employment as a white male, earning more money as a male, that I had some of the resources to go through transition in ways. I had the privilege of an employer that didn't fire me. Most trans people lose their jobs, they lose their friends, they lose, they go through very expensive divorces. Their kids sometimes don't speak to them. So I was so blessed in so many ways. I even went to a church here where I am a member up on Henderson Road, North Church, United Church of Christ, and I was their very first trans moderator. And they are open and affirming. And kind of like Aaron was saying with signage and stuff, and showing people that not just walking the walk, or talking the talk, but walking the walk. And so North Church, they had welcomed many trans people into their congregation, and it was pointed out in their open and affirming statement that they didn't specifically mention trans people or gender identity and expression. And they said, well, it's there, it says gender. But it wasn't specific. And so they said, okay, well, that's what we meant. We'll just change it. And we'll add gender identity and expression. And some of the people at the church stood up and said, no, let's have a week-long, I think it was a month-long, education program on transgender things. And we had like a weekend symposium. Because what they wanted to do was they wanted to have a vote to change their statement, and they wanted it to be unanimous. And that spoke volumes to me as a trans person, because they wanted every trans person to know that it was deliberate, and that they meant it, and that it was unanimous, so that if a trans person came in, they knew that the person sitting next to them welcomed them. Ultimately, I think it was almost unanimous. There was 2 to everyone else. And they think maybe those 2 people just didn't agree with the exact wording. So, but with the kids in the Sunday school class, it was unanimous. But anyhow, I feel sometimes, very often, I feel like I sort of have survivor's guilt because almost all the trans people I know struggle in so many ways. I often say, if you see a trans person, give them a hug because they've been through some kind of hell. And sad but true. I have a video here from the GLAD website, and it talks about health care for trans people, and it kind of intersects with some of what trans people face when it comes to health care. One of the things she said, 19% trans people reported being refused, flat out refused. And I know some friends who have gone to the doctor. A friend of mine, a trans woman, who blends very well. She's not someone anyone would pick out of the crowd as being trans. And she went to the doctor because she had hyperpigmentation, which I had some myself, and it's from the estrogen. And the sun reacts, and it'd be on your arms and your neck. And she had it really bad on her face, looked like a giant freckle on her face. And they were seeing her and trying to figure out, what they could do and what kind of skin regimes they could do to help lighten that for her. And when they found out she was trans, they basically just threw their hands up and said, well, you did this to yourself, get out of our office. And I can go on with other stories as well, but when you're trans and you go to the doctor, it has nothing to do with whether they can tell by looking at you if you're visibly trans or gender non-conforming, because like we talked about earlier with forms, there's really no way to hide it unless you just want to lie. And I've been to the doctor myself, but one of the first things they ask is, what surgeries have you had? And so right there, that, with myself, when I went for my top surgery, I had put down that I had rhinoplasty prior to that, and then SRS, which stands for sex reassignment surgery, and she didn't realize what that was, and I was purposely being a little bit evasive by not spelling it out. And so at some point, she had asked me about could I be pregnant or something like that, and then I kind of had to tell her, and she said, oh, okay. And she thought the SRS had something to do with my sinuses. So the anecdote there. And now a lady with the health department, when I first came out to her and told her I had GID, which stands for Gender Identity Dysphoria, she thought it was gastrointestinal disease. But anyways, getting back to the video that we just watched, the nurse there at the end, she reported that 28% of trans people have reported verbal harassment, and the one that shocked me was the 2% that reported actual physical harassment. So, and 50% had to explain what kind of care they needed to the healthcare professionals. So I think as myself as an EMT, I think as healthcare providers, we always need to be professional. And just to circle back for a second, something Aaron was talking about, these laws that they're trying to pass in various states. They've got the bathroom bills where they're targeting trans people, making it illegal for us to use public accommodations. And they're going even a step further to put bounties on our heads to actually fine the owners of the establishment if anyone catches us in there. And as with in Indiana, when Aaron spoke about that they could even be, and I had heard other people say this, public employees, I can't believe that. I mean, I've heard other people say that, but I just know myself in the city of Columbus and all the people that I work with, we take an oath. We take an oath of duty. I would never, whether it's legal or not, I would never deny service to anybody on the street in emergency services. It's really, it does kind of hurt when I was seeing all that stuff with Indiana and all the debates online and social media, and some otherwise seemingly nice, intelligent people would say, well, I don't discriminate against anybody. but I want my right. I don't want the government telling me what to do just because I'm in business. And I was like, well, the government regulates your business in all sorts of ways. And I just thought, wow, you know, people who I would help and risk my life for are more invested in telling me that they've got a right to discriminate. So that just shocks me. That's my editorial comment for the day. One of the problems with the word transgender, I think, is the definition has been evolving, and Aaron kind of touched on, we're using a term nowadays called cisgender, which is CIS gender, which is the opposite of transgender, and transgender is the opposite of cisgender. Which kind of makes it more clear, actually, believe it or not, because before people were using definitions that basically transgender as an umbrella term, which basically was an umbrella for anything that was gender variant, anybody who cross-dressed for any reason, for any amount of time, gender fluid, gender neutral. And I remember having a conversation with Jenny Boylan at GLAAD. I said, you know, part of the problem, it has such a vast meaning that you can't effectively communicate because so many people are using the word transgender in a specific way when it's a word so it is frustrating. It's frustrating even for people in the community. So when we say transgender, it can mean a lot of things. You know, I went to the NCTE, which is the National Center for Transgender Equality, had Lobby Day in Washington, D.C., as they do every year. And I think it was the year before last I participated in that. And I was surprised to find all these transgender people who didn't look anything like me. And they were people that I would maybe describe as gender neutral, gender non-conforming, gender queer. And they were identifying basically as transgender. So I thought, wow, that's going to be confusing for the lawmakers, you know, when all these people come in there. But as Jenny said, the best thing about the word transgender is that it's all inclusive. And the worst thing about it is that it's all inclusive. So I kind of, from that, I kind of learned to not focus so much on that, but just more of the human aspect of it. Just basically is a freedom for all of us, for everyone in this room, for every human being, to be free, to express yourself, to not be confined by social construct, gender, binary, like when Aaron was having you raise your hands on all those different binary questions, so, we've been raised to conform to society's expectations in so many ways. And I like to say that none of us are free until all of us are free to love who we love and be who we are. And especially to be who we are, because if we're not free to be who we are and be honest with the world about who we are, then this is not the country I thought I was growing up in, where we waved the flag and talked about how great freedom was. When you can't have that basic freedom. And one last point, I think we're getting close to questions, that being trans is not in and of itself a mental issue, mental health issue. It was changed in the DSM from disorder to dysphoria. However, being trans, the things, the anxiety and the pressures and the depressions and the different things that it can cause, can cause different mental problems. So I think it's important to be aware of that. And as they pointed out in the video, it's not special care. It's the same kind of care you give to any other human being. So it's just specific to what their needs are. Her question was, with hormone replacement therapy, has there been research on how that can bring up other health issues? And I'm not an expert in that. I'll let Aaron answer if he knows, but if they know, I'm sorry.
It's all good. It's all good.
I just kind of met Aaron. So.
Right.
Anyhow, it's the same as with any other woman that we do liver screening, make sure because hormones are harming the liver and kidneys and can cause increased chance of breast cancer. But there hasn't been any long-term studies that I know of for trans people.
I think one of the limitations with that study, or studies like that, is that there's been so much denial of care. And also engagement in medical research and comfortableness in engaging in medical research for the community can be really difficult. We also see a lot of, because of that denial of care, and something that the video didn't quite go into, they're fantastic videos, but because of that denial of care, people still need health care. And they talked a little bit about it when she's like, my friend came to my apartment later on a weekend and we're doing medical care in my living room. That's happening with alarming frequency in some communities. And it's also happening not so much in medical practitioners' living rooms, but friends' living rooms, which is even less adequate care. And we see a lot of aftermarket or non-market medical medicine, also unapproved medical devices being used, and it gets really dangerous. And so we have a system in which is pushing people out of healthcare, and the healthcare still needs to happen, but it's being provided by people that are not qualified to do so.
I have two questions. Just thank you for making it comfortable to do that. I'm really good at putting my foot in my mouth, but I feel okay doing it here. One is, as you were talking about the term transgender and trans woman or trans man, I didn't find it on here, on your gender bread. Would that be like the last two categories could possibly fit?
Transgender really goes under the blue category of gender identity. Somewhere along that line, yeah, those words aren't mentioned on this, but that's where it would be. It also goes into gender expression a little bit. So blue and yellow kind of make up that.
Okay. I didn't know if it could go under any of them, under the last two categories or not.
The last two categories are pretty mutually exclusive from it because their biological sex and our gender are separate, and then they're separate and distinct identities, and then attracted to is sexual orientation.
I know that a lot of people are interested, probably not always for the right reasons, in Bruce Jenner's transitioning, and I'm wondering if there's any fear in the community that this will just, without the right kind of assistance on set, become kind of a circus. And I guess I'm curious about how this is viewed. Is this seen as something very helpful, or the jury's out?
Well, the jury's out, but I will say that within the community, a lot of people were all experiencing a collective cringe. Mark Kiesling is the president of the NCTE, National Center for Transgender Equality, and she once, I forget who it was, somebody within the last few years that was very popular or very well known and came out. And she lamented about the fact that the news media does have a tendency to want to put a microphone in front of somebody that's going through transition. And when you go through transition, it's like you become literally Humpty Dumpty. You fall off the wall and into a million pieces, and you've got to put your life together. And not only are you transitioning, but everyone in your life and your sphere applies with me. My fire family, not just in my firehouse, but the whole fire family was transitioning, learning. The person who's transitioning is learning. Oftentimes they're not up to speed with what's going on in the community and the work that's been done and the narratives that have been agreed upon. And so, they're just not the best person to be have a microphone and I think for speaking as a trans person who went through that, it rehashes some of the most painful, difficult times that I went through in my life, and to watch somebody going through it, and then with the Jenner situation, it's just the Kardashians, the television circus. Yeah, the community is really kind of, we have a lot of anxiety about what's already happened, what's already happened in the news, news people following Bruce and making a circus out of it. So it's unfortunate.
I would just echo all of that. And I think that where my head goes to is, why are people curious, right? Is this coming from a genuine, like, want to learn about somebody else's lived experience, or our own curiosity? And if it's coming from our own curiosity, that can be dangerous, because then we're not looking at the lived experiences of trans people in our country and in our communities. And we're not looking at the poverty rates, we're not looking at the violence rates, we're not looking at the fact that just leaving your house can be a dangerous act. And so when we're looking at I'm going to call that the Kardashian view, it kind of trivializes things in a way. I don't want, and I want to be careful that I'm not speaking ill of Bruce's journey, because I think that's also something we as a community want to lift up. However, with people that have privilege, and media privilege is a privilege, and being very, very wealthy and having a publicist is a privilege, and people that run your Twitter account and things like that. You know, we don't have that. But I think that we need to be careful about the stories that we're consuming as the consumer of the story, and kind of look for that counter story, and not just take a celebrity's word for truth. There was an incident, did I call it an incident? I'm going to call it an incident. There was an incident on the Katie Couric show. Does anybody remember when Laverne Cox and Carmen Carrera were on the Katie Couric show? Anybody seen that? And there are clips on YouTube if you'd like to watch them as well, and they're quite good, where both Laverne Cox and Carmen Carrera, who are out trans women in the community, celebrities and models, actresses, and they actually take Katie Couric to task on this. Both Carmen and Laverne have had extensive media training, and do speak quite eloquently about trans issues most of the time. And so Katie Couric actually on broad daylight television asked them about surgeries, and they pushed back and said, you know what? That's not a good question to ask. And why is that good? And so I think that we can do things through media, through kind of that celebrity push, but it's not the end-all be-all, and it can be a dangerous place to be.
And here, I think we face, we'll have 26 people on each unit with many different biases, then add on a layer of, psychosis or other personality issues or criminal things. And then let's sit down and talk freely in a group and be safe.
Right.
Is there, when you're working with people, is there anything that you would add on beyond the basic, I think, like counseling, social work, psychology, where honor you, respect you, keep safety? When you're trying to educate others,
right.
I don't know. I don't know if I can narrow my question down any more than that.
I mean,
can be hints for those on the front lines.
Right, and I think what you're asking is very difficult. When adding on a layer of criminal activity or psychosis or other diagnosis that might actually exacerbate that bias in some way.
Or allow people not to censor.
Right, allow people not to censor that bias. I mean, ultimately what I think I would ask is that, or what I would say is that, even in those moments where people have more difficult censoring, are we intervening or are we providing guidance with them when they say other things about other identities, right? Or when they're violent towards race, or when they're violent towards creed or faith, or other people with different abilities. How are we interacting on those levels can guide us on how we interact on this level. And so in creating that safe space, kind of keeping safety and uncomfortability balanced against each other almost, that they're different concepts, but they're both important. And so that's a very difficult question, but that's where I would start. And I'd be happy to explore that more one-on-one or even in a small group if we want to do that sort of a meeting moving forward. And a lot of things too can be and again with the layers of identity that we're talking about and health that we're talking about, mental health, this can be challenging, but bringing up things when it's not an issue is also, it seeks to do cultural change a little bit more. Like when we say we serve all people, what do we mean by that? And explaining how services work to the community and to patients more often. Instead of, okay, we're about to have a trans person into the group, let's talk about trans people. So then it becomes an event for a lot of people instead of just how we do business. Now I understand there are nuances with mental health that make that even more difficult for some patients, but you know, I think that that's what we're headed toward, and we do probably need to work together to figure out how to get there, but that's where we're headed.
Sometimes I think when we have patients that have a psychiatric disorder or some psychosis, and they also are identifying in a certain gender or manner, it can get lumped together, and some of the staff believe, well, that's part of their delusion, or that's, you know, part of their illness.
Yeah, it can get lost in the shuffle of all the other things going on.
And then that doesn't get affirmed or accepted, it's the opposite way.
And I think to also, just to say a few things about that, I think that can get confusing and things can get lumped together. And it's our job, you know, we have the privilege in the moment when we're working with patients or when we're working with people that it's our job to unpack that for ourselves. And our job to keep identity, which gets complicated when we're talking about mental health. I understand that. I master's in social work and practiced therapy for a while before moving into more community work. But so I get that, and I used to work in a psychiatric ER setting, and so that was exciting. But but at the basic level, identity is separate from disorder, and so we just got to try to train our minds, like, you know, would it have an impact with a delusional patient that is also presenting as trans but also has delusions? Would it be negative to just refer to them as the identity that they are presenting as far as their gender and then work on the delusion? And I actually say no, that's not negative, and actually you may have better results because the patient isn't going to be resisting on every level. Like we can acknowledge and affirm the identity and still do mental health at the same time.
This is kind of a growing medical field. I was reading, you were talking about children, and I was reading in the paper just this week that there's a lot of controversy among doctors about doing the hormone therapy on children and what age they have to be before they would start doing hormone therapy and all that kind of thing.
Actually, I think they don't actually do hormone therapy on children, but when they start to reach adolescence, they'll do puberty blockers.
Okay.
And until they're 18, and then they can decide at that point.
And I think they were saying that's very controversial. Some doctors won't do it, and some will do it.
You know,
yeah. I mean,
to me, there's something I think that bears pointing out. It's just, it seems like with trans people in society, Bruce Jenner, for instance, for a trans woman who lives so many years as a male in sometimes very hyper masculine ways, and that is, I think, a product of trying to fit in to the only choice you think you have. And then when you finally reach a tipping point in transition, maybe it's too late to transition in a way physically that makes it easy to blend, and it makes it, quite frankly, a very large masculine trans woman is uncomfortable for a lot of people, and they fear that, but she's no different in the inside than me or any other woman. But, you know, so with the children, they have a unique opportunity, and many of us older, what we call late transitioners, you know, we look at the younger, the teenagers and children who get to transition, and we're very happy for them because we know that they won't have all those years of inner turmoil and conflict, and also they will be able to transition in a way that they will blend. Not that that's necessarily the goal, but let's face it, if you don't make people uncomfortable just by your presence, your physical presence, then things should go a lot smoother. But so to me, it's kind of, it just seems like, on one hand, they don't want, they're creating bathroom bills because they're uncomfortable with trans people, but on the other hand, they want to prevent young trans people from transitioning, and it's just, sometimes it's just maddening for me.
Mm-hmm. And I think that there's a lot of research coming out about sort of the puberty blocker, which is, it's not, I mean, it's a pretty low invasive treatment that doesn't really have, or I mean, the articles that I've read about it aren't indicating any sort of massive danger or unintended outcome. Now, there's still research being done, but essentially puberty stops from happening, and once you stop that, it will either take its natural course or hormone treatment will take a different course, right? So there's that. And then the other thing I wanted to say, there is a really great endocrinologist that has a TED Talk about this topic, and he's actually one of the leading research doctors on this topic. The other thing I wanted to mention too, since you brought up the bathroom bill again, that I didn't say earlier, is you know, it's about keeping trans people out of bathrooms. It's criminalizing urination, which sounds ridiculous to me, because it is. But what is the number one, people that are promoting these laws, what is their number one go-to reason why we need this law? Who are we keeping out of bathrooms?
They're concerned about sex offenders.
Right. Perpetrators, sex offenders, child molesters. Who are the child molesters? What's the profile? Heterosexual white men. How old? 40ish, 20, you know, 30s to 40s, maybe into 50s, right? Who are we not keeping out of bathrooms because we're being distracted by a bill of criminalizing peeing for trans people? We're not working on the real issue. It's a distraction. And it's a controversial distraction, so it's working. But we need to be talking about those issues too. We need to be keeping perpetrators out of bathrooms. That's important. But when we're confused and labeling an entire group of people as a negative thing, which happens to LGBT people all the time. In fact, I also say this because gay men and gay people get tagged with the pedophilia stereotype all the time. And that, we just described the typical profile for a pedophile, right? In fact, I actually say if we would only hire teachers for secondary and primary education that were LGBT, our kids would be safer. Right? So, we can think about that.
I think one of the biggest things that comes to my mind in the hospital is that, you know, the co-ed units, we try to put the females with the females and the males with the males, because there's 2 beds per room. And so, we're stuck sometimes. We have a birth-assigned male whose gender identity is female, and where are they comfortable, but then can we find a roommate that's comfortable with that choice? So I'm not sure, you know, how we have any suggestions on how to work with that issue.
Wrestling with being uncomfortable versus actually providing safety, and the fact that a patient is uncomfortable with another patient isn't necessarily a new thing. I think where it comes for me is the safety of the trans person, right? Will they be harmed in a room with somebody? That's a real question, right? And that's the question I wrestle with, versus providing a room that is more comfortable for somebody else. That's not, but will that person act out violently? or even act out in any way causing harm or trauma. And so I think we need to think about it more from that perspective. I mean, I definitely would want to move in the direction of housing by identity, not by biology, because that's where we really need to be headed. But housing in rooms of twos is complicated. Yeah.
I think when we're thinking of that specific situation, one thing to keep in mind is isolating a trans person at the very time when everyone else is being teamed up and paired up, and putting a trans person alone at the time where they probably need care can be quite dangerous. In fact, without sharing an anecdotal story, there was a time when that actually happened, and it was a very, very bad outcome.
So they need this
the
social connection with others.
Right, so coming up with some way to not have them just be isolated.
I mean, it just furthers that isolation, right? And
it can be the last straw.
Absolutely.
You know, when we talk about 40% of trans people committing suicide, that can be, you know, when they've reached the end of the road and then they're still isolated.
Right. I mean, it can, and like, all of a sudden I'm put in a room by myself because I can't be around population. Like, that message is really, really traumatic.
And it's one of those things where the hospital, you know, we think we're being helpful.
Right.
Any other questions? Thank you both very much.